Hi, I'm Kerrien Suarez. I'm Director of Equity in the Center. And Equity in the Center is a project that works to shift mindsets, practices, and systems in the social sector to drive race equity. We were created by a collaboration between ProInspire, Public Allies, and AmeriCorps alums back in 2016. The project grew out of the Annie E. Casey Foundation Talent Pipelines Lab. That was a cohort-based program in which grantees were brought together to really workshop the challenge of why leaders of color are so underrepresented at the highest levels of the social sector. And at the end of that program, they came up with the idea for Equity in the Center, which would be a collaborative effort to support leaders in their effort to drive racial equity across the social sector. What is it we want to achieve as Equity in the Center? Our goal ultimately is that all U.S. nonprofit and philanthropic organizations would be racially diverse at all levels and that they would be actively working toward racial equity internally and externally. Our long-term goal as part of that vision is for the social sector to transform from one characterized by a white dominant culture to one characterized by an equity culture that centers racial equity as a core goal of social impact. Our shared work and our stakeholders, a group of over 100 thought leaders in diversity, inclusion, and equity, as well as executives who are leading this work inside of organizations. They've encouraged us to speak boldly about our work and to frame it in terms of dismantling white supremacy and the system of institutional racism that characterizes the social sector. We'd like to replace it with one that values all humanity equally and centers the lived experience of all American citizens equally. Ultimately, we'd like to achieve race equity, and racial equity is defined as the elimination of racial disparities along key indicators, so education, income, housing, and health. How will we achieve it? Equity in the Center sees our role in achieving racial equity as driving deep equity to transform the social sector. We'll provide support for leaders within organizations to dismantle and mitigate racism at the 4 levels on which it operates: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. We have 3 strategies. The first is to accelerate leaders, to engage, support, and convene them, individuals from nonprofit and philanthropic organizations, for bold conversations to build their capacity to create racial equity within their organizations. Our second strategy is to support those leaders within their organizations more broadly and to support organizations in being aware of the practices and tools that measurably shift organizational culture toward racial equity. Our last strategy is to transform systems, influence institutional and systemic cross-sector systems to support and drive race equity within organizations and across the sector. In our first year, we've convened our stakeholders, an advisory committee of over 100 individuals. We pulled together 120 thought leaders in a series of discussions during which we defined and refined what we call the equity cycle, and it's a framework for organizational change within organizations. We'll publish that equity cycle this fall, and that's a tool that will be able to support leaders in achieving race equity within their organization. To support leaders, to accelerate them, according to our strategy, we will convene our stakeholders, our advisory committee, as well as invited guests at our first Equity in the Center Summit, which is October the 24th to 25th in Detroit, Michigan. And our goal really is to convene, connect, and engage our stakeholders and align them around our vision for impact in the social sector, as well as provide them with a space to outline existing effective resources to shift internal culture toward racial equity. Our goal during this session is to map the social sector so that individuals leading these efforts can quickly and easily identify effective resources to support them in the work, and to discuss how we as a project can support our stakeholders in their daily practice. The Equity Cycle publication, who's the audience? It will focus on leaders within organizations who are just starting or have been managing for some time an initiative to drive race equity within an organization. Most often our stakeholders come to us and ask, what can I do, where can I start? And this publication is an answer to that question. It outlines an equity cycle for organizational change, provides characteristics of organizations at each stage, and recommends tactics that leaders can employ to make measurable progress within their organization. The equity cycle has three stations, or three stages, I might say. The first stage is awake, and that's the earliest stage when an organization is just becoming aware that diversity is a topic on which they should focus. The work is transactional at that point. They're really counting the individuals of different races and ethnicities within the organization. The second stage is woke. Organizations have been awake to the work for some time. They understand the necessity of transforming their culture to be inclusive of minority perspectives and actively connect those perspectives to the attainment of their mission. At the last stage, the work stage, organizations have put processes and practices in place that achieve equity internally, and at the same time they advocate for racial equity outside of their organization. I will say that though we've defined this as a cycle, and I said finally in terms of achieving the work stage, this is a cycle. Organizations enter and leave it at different points, and at all three stages, awake, woke, and work, there are varying levels of depth at which different characteristics of equity have been achieved. Through the research, we identified a set of levers which have explicit tactics linked to them that organizations, leaders in this work can utilize and implement to make measurable progress within organizations. There'll be more detail on those tactics in the publication, but I do have an overview of what an equity culture looks like in an organization. These characteristics of an equity culture sort of cut across the levers I shared earlier. The first point is one we think is quite important. It puts a stake in the ground around the number of people of color that should be reflected in an organization. And so we're putting forward that a critical mass, roughly 30% of people of color should be reflected in leadership in an organization that has achieved an equity culture. We also believe that the mission of such an organization would explicitly state that race equity was part of what they were working to achieve in their communities, and that they openly address issues of race and racism at all four levels at which they operate. Staff, stakeholders, and leaders would be comfortable talking about race internally and externally. They'd be comfortable calling out microaggressions or inequities when and where they see them, and they would not experience repercussions for having done so, whether they're a person of color or whether they're a white person. Norms across the organization would promote positive, culturally responsible interpersonal interaction within teams, as well as with the communities with which organizations partner. And at the tactical, operational level, vendor and consultant relationships would also reflect that racial equity has been prioritized, both specifically in terms of contract terms and the lived experience and daily work of the organization. The organization would also actively request and act on being a critical part of the work, feedback that they solicit around racial equity inside and outside of the organization. I'll close by sharing the equity and the center call to action. We think it's important that both people of color and white people in the social sector question deeply how we do the work of nonprofits and who are the right individuals to be leading that work. We challenge our colleagues to adopt specific tactics to drive racial equity at the four levels at which racism operates. At the personal level, we encourage you to decolonize your mind. It's something we all need to do. Accept that white supremacy and institutional racism are real. It shows up in our daily work. Interrogate the dominant narrative, understand implicit bias, and the role that your identity play in enabling institutional racism. And complete your own internal work. Don't expect people of color within your organization or in your life to explain the system of institutional racism. Explore it and understand it for yourself. At the interpersonal level, we challenge you to respect the lived experience of people of color operating within a white dominant culture. Commit to building and being vulnerable and learning through relationships, genuine relationships with people of color. And also acknowledge the impact that race-based power differentials inside of an organization, how they play out in your daily work, in team meetings, in the decisions that are made. At the institutional level, we challenge you to commit to understanding and speaking publicly on the principles of race equity and how they apply in an institutional context. A good place to start would be by disaggregating staff engagement, performance, and compensation data by race at all levels, from top to bottom, and hold yourself as a manager, as a leader, as well as your organization more broadly, accountable to do so. Engage staff and communities of color to inform governance, decision-making, and execution across all aspects of your work. And lastly, at the systemic level, we challenge everyone to be accountable at the individual and organizational level for understanding and calling out racism at the 4 levels at which it operates: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. We challenge you to publicly advocate for race equity and challenge white dominant cultural norms, including naming microaggressions when and where they occur in the institutional and systemic context. And lastly, share power with people of color within and across teams, organizations, and systems. And we believe that in doing so, we'll be able to work together to drive race equity in the sector. Thank you.